Certain cases loom large in the history of the supernatural, especially in relation to the investigation of the supernatural. The 20th century provided the likes of the Enfield Poltergeist, and even Willington Mill in the 19th century offered an earlier opportunity, which we looked at last week. Yet the Tedworth Drummer offered an opportunity to explore a haunting in the 17th century. Our investigator, among others, was Joseph Glanvill, a Somerset vicar who juggled his religious belief in ghosts and witches with a passion for science. He defended the reality of the supernatural and supported his defence with accounts of ghosts, witchcraft and the devil, and he even investigated such cases himself. Now, the Tedworth Drummer has become his most famous account. But what was it all about? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I am having a few problems with my voice again, so if I do end up getting ever so slightly deeper, you know why. And I'm quite excited about this week's topic for weird reasons, but mostly because I was thinking we're doing supernatural things this month for obvious reasons because it is October, and we looked last week at Willington Mill in Wallsend, and this was kind of a weird early example of people actually trying to pry into something, whether it was supernatural or not, which I thought was really cool and kind of elevates it above just simply being, ooh, ghostly things happened. And it's like, yeah, ghostly things happened, but people looked into them and couldn't really find out what was actually going on. There's no real evidence that any of the stuff at Willington was actually a hoax. So I was thinking, oh, what shall I do for the next one? And I suddenly realised I've never done this case before, even though it's one of those like big ones in the sort of the history of paranormal investigation, I guess you could call it. And this is the Tedworth Drummer. And it is a really interesting story, but one of the reasons why I wanted to include it is because some of the activity sounds a lot more like fairy activity than ghosts. And I thought, ooh, that works quite well with the folklore theme, so that's why we're having a look at the Tedworth Drummer. And all of this takes us back to March 1661, or at least that's where it starts. It goes on for a good couple of years from there. And this all takes place in Tedworth in Wiltshire. John Mompesson was a magistrate, and he confiscated a drum from William Drury, who'd been trying to busk for money around the town. Not only that, Drury tried to get money from a local constable using forged papers. Now, for some reason, someone took the drum to Mompesson's house while he was in London, and his domestic arrangements were fairly standard because he shared his home with his wife and 3 children and his widowed mother. The evening the drum arrived in the house, strange noises occurred during the night. Now, Mrs. Mompesson actually put them down at burglars because the house actually looked like it had been turned over, but no one entered the house and nothing went missing. When Mompesson returned in April, Mrs. Mompesson then told him about the noises around the house. Now, he also heard them 3 nights later when knocking on the outer walls woke him up. When knocks then came from inside the house, Mompesson seized his pistols and raced downstairs. The knocks came thick and fast on the internal doors, and every time Mompesson threw the door open, the knocking moved to a different door, and he found that there wasn't actually anyone downstairs. Eventually, he had nothing else to do but to go back to bed. But at that point, he actually heard the sound of drumming above the house. You do sometimes see an image about this of like this phantom drummer above the house, sort of playing the drum in the sky, as it were. Now, all of this went on for a few weeks, with the drumming starting once the family put out their bedroom lights. The sounds focused on the room where the drum lay, and Mompesson even tried sleeping in the same room as the drum, but no human arrived to play it. At some point, Mrs. Mompesson actually gave birth, and the sound stopped altogether on the night of the birth, which I dare say she was obviously quite pleased about. And the family got 3 weeks of peace before the noises started up again. Now, on the 5th of November, and bearing in mind this all started in March, the noises started to focus on the children's room. Boards would loosen and start rearing up as if they were alive, and a servant pushed them back only for the boards to rear up again, and this happened some 20 times until Mompesson eventually scolded the servant for actually challenging the presence in the first place, and those present noted the distinct smell of sulphur in the room. Now, I am going to interject at this point because if you've ever watched ghost hunting programs, particularly American ones, they will always link the smell of sulphur to the demonic and things like that. And I think I might have mentioned before, there was one time I did one of the ghost walks around Edinburgh, and we ended up in the particular tomb in the Covenanters prison that they claim is the Mackenzie tomb, even though it's actually not, but never mind. And there was a bit of a weird smell in there because it was damp stone in Edinburgh in December, and damp stone has a very particular odour. And there's one woman, "Oh, I think I can smell sulphur." And I just thought, how many people actually know what sulphur smells like? You know what I mean? Most people would go, "Oh God, that's a foul smell," or "Oh, that smells like rotten eggs." That's the kind of thing we're talking about. You wouldn't generally immediately ascribe that to sulphur. And obviously, people make smells that are a bit like that. So I can't help thinking that, given the number of people that were in the room at the time in Montpesson's house, there's probably a more logical reason for the sudden smell of sulphur. But there we go. The local vicar did come to pray in the room, and once he'd finished his prayers, chairs actually danced around the room. And you might have noticed that I've referenced people being in the house at the same time. And this is one of the things that makes this a really interesting case. There's only a few handfuls of the activity which only happen when one person's present. There's usually more often a few people present, and it wasn't just the local vicar or servants either, because people would actually visit the house to experience the phenomena for themselves. I don't know what these people were expecting was going to happen, but they were basically turning up and being like, "Oh, I hear your house is haunted. I would like to hear this for myself," sort of attitude. That's essentially what's going on. And at one point, one of these people actually called out to Satan, having assumed that the drummer conjured him to do the work around the house. And he asked Satan to give them 3 knocks and nothing more. And then 3 knocks responded and nothing more. So people took that to mean there was an intelligent presence that was capable of interpreting what the people were saying and then essentially responding to it in kind. Now, another visitor actually remarked that fairies might be making the sounds, and they were known for leaving money. Where he got that from, I have absolutely no idea. But there we go, that was the claim he made. And the presence added the sound of jingling coins to its repertoire in response. On another occasion, a sound of purring came from the children's bed, while strangers saw nothing to make the sound. And they also saw the bedclothes and children lifted out of the bed, and 6 men couldn't hold them down. Bearing in mind that these 3 kids are obviously all quite young at this point. I don't think any of them are over 10, and 6 men can't hold them down. They're being lifted off the bed with such force. And whatever this force was, it even emptied chamber pots into the beds, put a metal spike in Mr. Montpesson's bed, and also an upright knife in his mother's bed. So it's not really a very nice thing to have around the house. But at this point, Joseph Glanvill enters the story. And Joseph Glanvill, as I mentioned in the introduction, was a vicar who had this passion for the supernatural. And he came to visit in 1662 in an effort to actually find proof of the supernatural. So he heard the scratching noises in the girls' room, but he realised that A, there was no animal in the room that might be making the sounds, and B, he could also see the girls' hands, so they couldn't be responsible for the noise either. So I thought that was quite interesting that he obviously investigated what was the source and was like, well, it's not the kids doing it, and there's no animals, so it must be something else. He did try putting his hand down the back of the bed where the sound seemed to come from, and the sound stopped until he withdrew his hand. He also scratched the bed linen 5, 7 and 9 times, and the presence then scratched out the same numbers in response. Glanvill actually slept at the house as well, and surprisingly, he actually enjoyed a good night's sleep, which is good for him, I suppose. But in the morning, knocking outside his door woke him up. He asked who it was, obviously thinking it might be someone literally just knocking on the door, to no response. And eventually he cried, "In the name of God, who is it and what would you have?" And he finally got an answer, "Nothing with you." Whatever this force was, it wasn't really particularly interested in Glanvill, though only really interested in the family. Now Glanvill grew convinced that a demon or spirit must be behind it all, and when he made preparations to leave, he found his horse lathered in sweat as if it had been running all night. It went lame after a mile or so and died 2 days later. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for some time, you will recognise that as hag riding, which I have covered a couple of times, which is the folklore phenomenon in which a horse will basically look like it's been ridden all night because it's been borrowed either by a witch or by fairies, and they've then ridden it to the point of exhaustion, essentially. So I think it's quite interesting that while this is supposed to be a haunting, we've now got something that's far closer to fairies or witch activity. And obviously there were other phenomena as well, which are also really interesting. So on Christmas Eve 1661, the presence actually attacked Mompesson's son while he was on his way to the toilet. And on Christmas Day, it buried a Bible in the ashes in the hearth. In January 1662, servants heard singing in the chimney. Strange lights moved around the house, including a blue one, and people also heard the rustling of silk in empty corridors. And again, this one might make you go, hang on a second. The idea of lights moving around the house, again, to me, doesn't actually necessarily suggest ghosts, but it does suggest some kind of fairy activity. But the rustling of silk made me think of the Northeast spirit, Silky, like that's literally where she gets her name, and the fact that she's very mischievous, so she would kind of play tricks on people. And I think if you then end up with almost like a brownie type figure in your house, a lot of the activity kind of sounds a little bit like one that's just gone rogue. So I thought that was really interesting that they could hear the rustling of a very expensive material in these empty corridors. Now, somebody also spread ashes on the floor to catch the footprints of the perpetrator, which feels a little bit Scooby-Doo, but I quite like that. And all they actually found were circle scratches and the imprint of a claw. Now, obviously you might go, maybe somebody else made them, but how on earth would someone have been able to walk on the ashes without leaving their own footprints in order to leave something else? It does make you think. So I love the fact that, again, they're like, oh, let's try and get some evidence of this, or let's find out what's going on. And that's kind of the drive behind a lot of this stuff, and that's one of the reasons why it's such an interesting case. But the phenomena continued for 2 years, and you just think, who has the patience for that? Like, the fortitude of this family must have been immense. Also, you might remember that I mentioned William Drury at the beginning, and he's still sort of in the picture. Now, obviously, having had his drum confiscated, he ended up languishing in prison in Gloucester, having been arrested for theft. Now, in 1663, he asked one of his visitors about the drumming in Tedworth, and the visitor told him what was happening, and he told them, and I quote, "I have plagued him, and he shall never be quiet till he hath made me satisfaction for taking away my drum," end quote. A judge sentenced Drury to transportation for the theft, obviously nothing to do with the original stuff to do with Mompesson, but Drury escaped from the barge and returned to Wiltshire. Now, Mompesson learned of Drury's confession, and then when Drury was rearrested and he ended up sitting on trial again, witchcraft ended up on the charge list. Now, the court didn't actually convict him of witchcraft for one reason or another, but they did eventually sentence him to transportation again, and this time he did finally go to America. Now, despite all of this, Mompesson also looked into Drury's past because he was convinced that Drury must have something to do with what was going on. And it turned out that Drury was a soldier for the parliamentarians during the Civil War, but he also spent time working for a vicar where he apparently read the vicar's books of sorcery. So there is a bit of an implication that perhaps Drury was actually behind all of this, but had somehow summoned diabolical forces to do his bidding for him. And it does seem a little bit interesting that a lot of it sort of goes off once Drury leaves the country, but you can make of that what you will. Because despite all of this going on, visitors are still turning up to hear the sounds in Mompesson's house. And I feel quite sorry for Mompesson at this point, because it's like, it's not annoying enough when someone turns up uninvited, but when there's tons of them, it must really, really get on your nerves. And entertaining such a crowd of guests was also very expensive. And eventually one of the visitors actually reported a rumour they'd heard that 2 of the maids were behind the whole thing, trying to scare Mompesson's mother. Now, the staff actually proved to be a bit of a source of contention anyway, because Mompesson couldn't actually chide them for a bad attitude because of the fact that he couldn't get anyone to replace them. So they could more or less be as terrible as they wanted, and there was nothing that he could really do because he couldn't hire anyone new because he lived in a haunted house. So that was also annoying for him. Now, not all visitors actually got to see the activity, because Charles II sent a committee to investigate, and nothing actually happened while these 2 members of his court were there. Sir Christopher Wren even dropped by to hear what was going on, and he noted that people only heard the knocks if a particular maid was in the next room, and he also noted how thin the walls were. Now, Samuel Pepys recorded a conversation with Lord Sandwich about the phantom drummer, and as Lord Sandwich explained, the drummer could apparently copy tunes played to it, but then one particularly complicated piece utterly confused it. Now, obviously, if this had been demonic or even fairy in nature, it would have been able to copy it despite the level of complexity, so Lord Sandwich suggested a human was behind it after all. So was it a hoax? Well, a rumour spread that Montpesson had admitted everything was a hoax to Charles II, and it's not that he was doing the hoax, it's more that he discovered it was all a cheat, as they often put it in the books, and I think it was the idea that Montpesson himself wasn't behind it, but he supposedly discovered that somebody else was. And the idea that it was fake appeared in the display of supposed witchcraft from 1677, and Hogarth actually mocked it in an engraving after the Cock Lane ghost incident of 1762, which does actually bear quite a lot in common with this one. Now, Glanvill actually published Sedissimus Triumphatus in 1662, and his account of the Tedworth Drummer made him famous. He talks about it in Sedissimus Triumphatus as part of his evidence for the supernatural. And while people really did ridicule Glanvill for his supernatural beliefs, Glanvill actually positioned himself as one presenting evidence of ghosts that were perceivable using the senses. So in other words, the sensory perception of ghosts provided evidence that they existed. Now, he did suffer attacks on his integrity, and the 1681 edition then added testimonials from Montpesson attesting that everything was true, and Glanvill died in 1682. Even now, many assume that Drury was somehow responsible, so the knife in the bed was a warning sign from Drury's associates, while the initial burglary that began the entire affair could have been an attempt to reclaim the drum. That said, the drumming continued even after someone burned the drum in a field, and most of the activity was witnessed by multiple people, making it less likely that someone just simply imagined something. And obviously, think about it logically, grown men couldn't hold down floating children. And in addition, the dogs didn't bark during the activity. So if it was supernatural in nature, potentially that might prevent them from barking. I suppose if the activity was being done by someone they knew, then they might not bark, but the dogs didn't seem particularly bothered by what was going on around them, which really seemed to strike people as unusual. But the biggest thing that we have to think about is if it was a hoax, who actually profited from it? Montpesson certainly didn't. He couldn't work because he hated leaving his family alone. Also, it was getting incredibly expensive for him. He sort of ended up being a bit of a figure of fun for the whole thing, so Montpesson got absolutely nothing out of it. And while Drury might have earned some satisfaction from it, it does seem unlikely that his associates could keep it up for 2 whole years. And even if the staff were behind it, it seems mind-boggling that no one uncovered the trickery for such a long period. Now, interestingly, John Wesley's eldest brother Samuel was at Oxford with Montpesson's son. Samuel asked if it was a hoax, and Montpesson's son replied no, it was all true, but the visitors were getting too expensive to host. So the general belief is that Montpesson admitted it was a hoax to get people to go away because he couldn't afford to keep paying people and putting them up for the night, just so that they could have some free entertainment at his expense. Now, it is true it could have all been an elaborate hoax, but it could have also been a genuine haunting, and more intriguingly, it could have also been an instance of fairy activity. So we might look at the ability to copy sound, the invisibility, the hag riding of Glanvill's horse, the rustling of silk around the house, the strange lights around the house. Now, I must admit, the metal spike and the knife do both complicate the fairy theory, because both of them would presumably include iron, a material that famously the fairies don't like. However, there's nothing to say that a human didn't capitalise on the weird activity to add their own flourishes. Because if you want to have a go at an employer or scare someone's mother, you do think if all this weird stuff was already going on, you might add your own little bits to it as well and take advantage of it. But as Owen Davies notes, and I quote, "The exposure of frauds was no proof that ghosts did not exist. If as much time and effort was given to investigating every instance of apparent spirit activity as they did the Cock Lane ghost, then a genuine case would eventually be confirmed beyond doubt," end quote. And it's interesting that there was so much focus placed on the Cock Lane ghost, and I do have a bonus episode about that on Patreon if anyone wants to learn more about that, because there was so much investigation of it. And I think, as I say, there was so much investigation of the Tedworth Drummer as well, that there was this belief that if every time something like this happened, there was plenty of investigation. Eventually, they would find one that was genuine. Now, while the Tedworth Drummer has never been, and probably never will be, confirmed beyond doubt, who knows if there is a case in future that could be. So what I want to know is, what do you think? Do you think the Tedworth Drummer was all a hoax? Do you think it might have been a genuine haunting? Do you think it might have actually been a combination of the two? Because obviously there's nothing to say that people might not have just added their own bits to something that was going on. Do you think it was fairies? Was it witchcraft? Was it the devil? Who knows? Let me know what you think though, because obviously there's no way of knowing one way or the other, but we can always speculate. And I think the thing I liked about this particular story was the level of investigative activity that went along with it, and I think that sat really nicely with the Willington Mill episode last week. Obviously, next week and the week after, I will be recounting some of your supernatural encounters that you have been submitting. Obviously, like I say, I'm not debunking these. I'm just literally recording them for posterity on the podcast. So the form is still open and still will be until Wednesday, if you're listening to this on Saturday when it comes out, because obviously I do need at some point to actually put them together and record them. So if you are listening and you do want to report one of your supernatural encounters, as I say, the form is there until Wednesday. And as I say, that's what will be the last 2 episodes of this month. Just, I thought it's a really good way to kind of preserve what has happened to other people as well. And even if you're a skeptic, you still might want to listen anyway, just to see what kind of encounters people are having, because it may make you suddenly go, hang on a minute, I had that weird encounter once as well, and it was very similar. Now, I thought mine was this, that, and the other, but who knows? So it's one of those kind of things where it's quite good to look at what other people are experiencing as well. But anyway, that is enough from me for this week. I do hope that you have a marvellous week ahead. If anyone is wondering why I haven't mentioned Hurricane Milton, it's because at the time of recording it's Wednesday and he hasn't arrived yet. So obviously my heart absolutely goes out to the people affected by Hurricane Helene. And I have put a couple of links to mutual aid organisations in the show notes if you either have been affected or you would like to try and help people who have been. And obviously, as I say, Hurricane Milton hasn't arrived yet, so I can't really comment on that at this point. But I always record my episodes a few days in advance, so that's why I don't always necessarily respond to stuff that's going on, because who knows what the state of play will be by the time the episode comes out. But anyway, I hope they have a nice week. I hope that everybody stays safe, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.